The moment Violet's eyes snapped open, she was already sitting in a velvet-lined seat, the gentle sway of a moving train rocking her like an uneasy cradle. She stared at the passing countryside, streaks of faded gold and burnt orange. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't recall stepping aboard. It was as if she'd awakened midway through someone else's life. Resting across her knees lay an ivory envelope. The ink so ornate it seemed to shimmer when she blinked. She read the message again, though each line felt as distant as a half-forgotten dream. A formal supper awaits you at Blackthorn Hollow Manor on the 31st of October. Your appearance is required. Transportation will meet you at Whitby Station at 6 o'clock. The host anticipates your arrival. No name, no clue, only a faint floral scent clinging to the paper, fragile and ghost-like, as though it had traveled decades to reach her hands. Violet tucked the invitation away, but a dull ache stirred in her chest. Blackthorn Hollow. Why did the name feel like something whispered to her long ago, a memory just out of reach? She pressed her forehead to the window, watching the moors stretch endlessly beneath a pale, cold sky. The train screeched into Whitby Station. The platform was nearly silent, the kind of quiet that made the air feel too heavy. A lone man stood beside an immaculate vintage car, his posture sharp and rigid. Miss Harrington. His voice was smooth but carried an edge like velvet hiding a blade. I am Cartwell, your driver. She followed him to the old Bentley, its chrome gleaming as if it had been polished for royalty. As they pulled away, Violet noticed something strange. Several other cars, each holding a single traveler, all moving together down the winding coastal roads, all heading into the same deepening dusk. It looked less like a convoy and more like a procession. She leaned forward slightly. This dinner, is it some kind of celebration? Cartwell met her eyes in the mirror for only a heartbeat. All will be revealed, miss. The higher they climbed into the moors, the more the world seemed to dim. Dense hedges swallowed the last fragments of daylight until the road ahead became nothing but a narrow ribbon leading into darkness. Then the manor appeared. Rising out of the fog like a cathedral built from night itself, Blackthorn Hollow Manor looked untouched by time. Towering spires clawed at the low clouds, and its windows, long, thin, and dark as pitch, reflected no light at all, as though the house refused to acknowledge the world around it. Cartwell brought the car to a slow stop. We've arrived, he murmured, though he didn't sound pleased to say it. Ahead of them, the other passengers stepped onto the gravel circle. 9 silhouettes, each moving with the same uncertain hesitation Violet felt heavy in her bones. Strangers, all summoned by the same mysterious call, and all standing before a place that seemed to breathe with its own quiet, waiting hunger. They stood gathered on the gravel drive, each dressed with the same formal precision, as though they'd all received invisible instructions long before arriving. Violet felt a prickle of unease. No one looked surprised to be here, only wary. A dignified woman with hair like polished silver stepped forward first, her gloves pristine against the fading light. Cordelia Ashworth, she introduced herself, her tone polite yet brisk. Quite remarkable, isn't it? 9 strangers reaching this place at the exact same moment. Violet took her hand gently. Violet Harrington, remarkable or intentional? One by one, the others offered their names, forming a circle of unfamiliar faces bound by the same unspoken question. There was Dr. Felix Carmichael, his calm eyes gleaming behind thin wire glasses, the sort of man who carried authority without ever having to raise his voice. Next came Miss Beatrice Fairchild, clutching her handbag like a lifeline, her knuckles pale with tension. Rupert Blackstone introduced himself with a firm nod, the unmistakable stiffness of a former officer still etched into his posture. Beside him stood Mrs. Phyllis Thornfield, adorned in jewels that scattered the dim evening light like shards of ice. Cecil Underwood gave a jerky smile, forever pushing his spectacles higher on his nose. Nerves seemed stitched into his every movement. Imogene Sterling drifted forward next, a young woman with paper-white skin and a timid presence, as though sunlight was something she only heard about in stories. Algernon Fitzwilliam rested heavily on a carved wooden cane, his weathered face lined with years of unspoken wisdom. Finally, there was Dorothea Clement, who did not step into the group but lingered at the edge, eyes narrowed toward the manor as if recognizing an old enemy. "Well," Dr. Carmichael announced, straightening his coat, "standing in the cold won't reveal anything. Let's go within. Our mysterious host surely expects it." The giant wooden door yawned open as though waiting specifically for them. Violet wasn't sure whether someone had opened it moments before, or whether it had been open all along. Inside, candlelight quivered against rough stone walls, their footsteps booming across the hall like muffled thunder. Something about the house seemed to breathe, a slow, ancient inhale echoing from the darkness above. A towering grandfather clock struck 7. Each chime vibrated through the air, deep and hollow, leaving a strange heaviness behind. "Hello," Dr. Carmichael called out. "We've arrived." Silence answered. Only the soft creak of timbers responded, as though the house shifted its weight in greeting. Mrs. Ashworth tugged her stole tighter. "Perhaps our host is occupied. Estates this size tend to have endless problems." They followed a long corridor where ancient portraits watched with unsettling intensity. Every painted gaze seemed to track them, subtle but undeniable. At last they found the dining room. It was breathtakingly beautiful and profoundly wrong. A massive table stretched nearly the length of the room, covered in delicate china so thin it might shatter under the weight of a whisper. Silver candelabras glowed with trembling flames, casting the walls in restless shadows. 10 places, Miss Fairchild murmured, clutching her purse tighter. "But there are only 9 of us." Mr. Blackstone pulled out a chair for Mrs. Thornfield with a courteous nod. "Then the final seat belongs to the host. No cause for alarm." They slowly settled into the seats arranged for them, each person glancing once, then twice, at the empty chair at the head of the table. It felt less like someone was missing, and more like someone was already there. The only sound threading through the room was the slow, deliberate ticking of a clock hidden somewhere beyond the reach of the candles. Violet's gaze drifted from one guest to the next, studying them with growing suspicion. Their faces were unfamiliar, yet oddly recognizable, as though she had glimpsed them all somewhere in the fog of a fading dream. At last, Dr. Carmichael cleared his throat. "If I'm honest," he admitted, his hands folded neatly before him, "I can't quite recall agreeing to any of this. The invitation arrived, and somehow it felt necessary to obey." A soft chorus of uneasy murmurs swept the table. Imogene Sterling twisted her napkin so tightly it looked ready to tear. "On the drive up, I kept thinking I'd traveled the same road before. Every bend felt rehearsed." "The Moors play strange games," Mr. Fitzwilliam replied, though doubt clouded his eyes. "When a landscape stretches on with no beginning or end, one can easily lose their hold on time." Mrs. Thornfield reached for her wine, hesitated midair. Did any of us actually see the host? I don't recall anyone greeting us. Their glances darted across the table, searching, questioning, afraid of what the answer might be. The candle flame sputtered wildly, as if disturbed by a gust no one could feel. Mr. Underwood adjusted his spectacles with shaking fingers. Perhaps we should simply start our meal. The host may prefer to observe before joining us. Almost as if his words had triggered some invisible mechanism, steam curled upward from their bowls. They stared in disbelief. The first course had appeared without a sound. No footsteps, no servants, just there. A rich, dark soup glimmered beneath the candlelight. "Turtle soup," Dorothea Clement said softly. Her tone was distant, nostalgic. A traditional opening for formal dinners of certain circles. "Is it?" Mrs. Ashworth whispered. "I can't recall attending anything so refined in years, or perhaps ever." One tentative spoonful became two, and soon warmth spread through them, thawing the October chill pressing through the manor's ancient stones. Course after course followed, arriving as silently and mysteriously as the first. A hearty game pie with a buttery crust, perfectly roasted fowl whose skin crackled under the knife, vegetables perfumed with herbs that smelled both familiar and foreign, wine that shimmered like garnet under the flickering light. For a moment, the strange enchantment of the meal outweighed their unease. Mr. Blackstone leaned back, his stern posture softened by the wine. "You'll think me mad," he said with a half-smile, "but I swear I've sat here before, right in this chair as if reliving something I've forgotten." Mrs. Ashworth rose abruptly, crossing the room with a strange purpose. She pressed her palm to the wallpaper, a design of intertwined roses winding across the walls like living vines. "I know this pattern," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I know this room. I've been here. I'm certain of it." She traced the roses slowly, and as she did, the wallpaper seemed to pulse beneath her touch, shifting ever so slightly, like something alive remembering her. "I know this," Mrs. Ashworth whispered, tracing the curling roses with a trembling finger. "When I was frightened, I used to count the thorns. I can still feel where they were." Across the table, Dr. Carmichael absent-mindedly reached for a candle and shifted it an inch to the right. "This side burns unevenly," he muttered, and then froze, his face draining of color. "But how in heaven's name would I know that?" Before anyone could question him, Imogene Sterling pushed back her chair with sudden resolve. She crossed to a seam in the paneling and pressed a point on the carved wood without hesitation, as though her hand remembered something her mind did not. A small door clicked open. "The passage for the servants," she murmured. "It runs straight to the kitchen." Miss Fairchild let her fork fall, the clatter slicing through the moment. "Please," she snapped, voice cracking. "Enough of this. You're frightening me." "But you feel it too," Miss Sterling insisted, her lip trembling. "Don't you? This sense that all of us have been here before." "I feel nothing," Miss Fairchild said too quickly. She reached for her wine, but her shaking hand betrayed her. Despite their unease, the meal pressed on. The rich courses kept appearing, each dish more elaborate than the last. Conversation drifted around the table like mist, but the details people shared were strangely hollow, as if everyone remembered the outlines of their lives, but none of the defining strokes. Dr. Carmichael spoke of his medical practice, but couldn't recall what train he took to work. Mrs. Thornfield tried to describe her late husband's company, only to falter with a helpless shrug. Even Violet noticed her own memories slipping like sand between her fingers. Then, during the fish course, Mr. Cecil Underwood gave a small cough. At first it was barely noticeable, a clearing of the throat, a polite apology. But the cough deepened, rough, hacking, violent. Mr. Underwood's face flushed red, then shifted to an alarming purple. His eyes widened behind his spectacles as he clawed at his collar, gasping soundlessly. "Are you all right?" Dr. Carmichael rose with sudden urgency. Underwood couldn't answer. His mouth opened, then closed again, desperate, helpless, like a dying fish dragged onto a deck. He knocked over his wine glass, the dark liquid spilling across the white cloth in slow, spreading streaks that looked disturbingly like fresh blood. "He's choking," Mrs. Ashworth cried out, half standing, half collapsing against the table. Dr. Carmichael reached him instantly, trying to lift the man, trying to force air back into his lungs, but the older man's body convulsed violently in his arms. "Hold on," the doctor urged. "Hold on." But the struggle drained from Mr. Underwood's limbs in seconds. His skin shifted from blue to ash gray. His head slumped forward, hitting the china with a dull thud. His spectacles slipped off, fell to the stone floor, and shattered. Silence swallowed the room whole. Miss Clement moved first. With eerie composure, she reached over and gently slid Mr. Underwood's eyelids shut, as though performing a task she had repeated many times before. Too many times. Her calmness chilled Violet more than the death itself. "Is he?" Miss Sterling whispered, unable to finish the thought. Dr. Carmichael pressed his fingers to Underwood's neck, waited, then lowered his hand. "There's no pulse," he said softly. "He's gone." Mrs. Thornfield broke into sobs, her cries echoing like something shattered across the dim, candle-lit room. And all Violet could think was, "We were 10 place settings, now we are 8. "But how?" Miss Sterling whispered, voice cracking under the weight of fear. "How can a man be laughing one moment and dead the next?" Miss Clement placed her napkin on the table with slow, deliberate precision. Her eyes held a grief that was far too practiced, as though she had seen this scene play out many times before. "Sudden death at dinner isn't as rare as people think," she murmured. "But the timing, yes, the timing is unusual." "Unusual," Mr. Blackstone's composure finally splintered. "He was fine, perfectly fine. Something is terribly wrong here." All eyes drifted to the empty chair, to the wine-stained cloth, to the stillness that clung to the space where Mr. Underwood's body lay moments ago. The candle flames wavered, stretching and shrinking in strange patterns that made shadows crawl across the dead man's absence. "We need help," Violet said softly, though her voice didn't shake the way she expected. "Someone must be able to." "There's no one to call," Dr. Carmichael interrupted gently. "And even if there were, nothing could have saved him." Mrs. Ashworth pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "We can't just sit here. We can't keep eating while a man lies." But before she could finish, a collective gasp swept around the table. Mr. Underwood's body began to dissolve. At first it was a soft blurring, as if the candlelight were melting him out of existence. Then the edges of his suit flickered like dust caught in a sunbeam. Bit by bit, chair and all, he vanished, until there was nothing left but an untouched place setting in stale silence. 8 guests remained, and not one of them dared to breathe. Only Miss Clement moved, calmly nudging her fork into place as though she were correcting poor etiquette rather than witnessing the impossible. "Did everyone?" Mrs. Thornfield started. "We saw," Mr. Blackstone said sharply. his gaze locked on Miss Clement as though she held a secret she refused to share. All of us saw. The question isn't what happened, it's what we're sitting in the middle of. Mrs. Thornfield wiped at her eyes with shaking hands. "I want to leave," she whimpered. "I don't care where I go, I just need to get out of this house." "Then we'll go," Dr. Carmichael said firmly. "Every one of us. This evening has turned intolerable." Chairs scraped as they tried to rise, but not a single person managed to stand. A cold, unseen grip clamped them in place. It wasn't physical. It wasn't violent. It was simply absolute. What is this?" Mr. Fitzwilliam strained against the force with all the strength left in his aging arms. His walking stick slipped from his grasp and hit the floor with a hollow crack. "Why can't we move?" Panic swept around the table like a living thing. Miss Sterling sobbed. Mr. Blackstone cursed under his breath. Mrs. Thornfield clutched her pearls as if they could protect her. "Please," Violet called into the darkness beyond the candles, her voice echoing into unseen corners. "If someone is listening, if someone brought us here, just tell us what you want from us." The only answer was the sound of the grandfather clock in the entrance hall striking 9. Each chime rolled through the manor like a pulse, slow and heavy. With the 9th note, the table trembled and new plates appeared before them. Perfectly carved roast beef, crisp Yorkshire pudding, vegetables glistening with butter, still steaming as though freshly prepared. The smell was rich, comforting, terribly out of place. No one reached for their cutlery. Not anymore. The moment Mr. Underwood collapsed, the room seemed to tilt. Violet felt her stomach twist, yet her hand, trembling, still drifted toward her plate as though pulled by invisible strings. Her fingers dug into her throat as she struggled for air, knocking her glass to the floor. Every breath came out thinner than the last. "Not again," she rasped, barely more than breath. Dr. Carmichael lunged toward her, but his arm slid straight through her, as useless as smoke. Violet's eyes bulged with panic as she fought for a breath that simply wasn't there. Her body sagged forward, twitching once, then going still. A heartbeat later, her outline dissolved. She vanished like dust swirling into the dark. "7 left," a voice murmured. "Only 7 at a table meant for 10. Dr. Carmichael stared at the empty chair, his face draining of color. "This can't be real. People don't disappear." Miss Clement tilted her head. "Is that what you believe, Doctor?" Her calm, knowing voice cut deeper than the cold creeping through the room. Half the guests shivered. The other half were too shocked to move. Mrs. Ashworth slammed her palm on the table. "Enough riddles. What are you implying?" Miss Clement's smile was small and merciless. "I'm asking why any of you came here tonight. What drew you to this house? What made you say yes?" Mrs. Ashworth hesitated. "I received an invitation." "But what compelled you to accept it?" Her mouth opened, then slowly closed. Her complexion drained to a ghostly white. "I don't remember," she whispered. "We're all the same," Mr. Blackstone muttered. "Our memories skip, like pieces have been cut out." Before anyone could answer, the table shimmered, another course appearing from thin air. A pale fillet of fish, bathing in cream, surrounded by tiny potatoes. Steam curled from the plate like beckoning fingers. They wanted to recoil. They wanted to refuse. But their hands rose on their own fork after fork, bite after bite. "There's a hole in our memories," Violet's fatting voice echoed, as though from somewhere behind them. "A missing piece." "Or a piece you refuse to face," Miss Clement murmured. That's when Mrs. Thornfield jolted upright with a strangled gasp. Her jeweled fingers clamped around her throat, but this was no choking. Her body convulsed violently as her eyes rolled back, foam bubbling from her lips. Dr. Carmichael watched with grim clarity. Poison, a fast, merciless kind. Her limbs thrashed once more, then fell still, jewelry clinking softly as her body slumped. Another seat at the table was empty, another soul erased. The last tremor rolled through Mrs. Thornfield's body, rattling her chair as though the wooden frame itself recoiled. Her final breath scraped out of her lungs like a dying draft of wind, and then her form blurred, thin, and dissolved into nothing. 6 chairs occupied, 4 missing. Miss Fairchild clutched the edge of the table, her voice trembling. It's happening to all of us, one by one. We're all going to die here. Mr. Fitzwilliam slammed his fist down, silverware jumping. But why? What crime could possibly justify this? What have we done? Miss Clement's eyes softened with a strange, pitying certainty. What have you done? She echoed. My dear Mr. Fitzwilliam, you already know. Every one of you does. His face drained of color. No, I buried that. I refused to. It was so long ago. Was it? Miss Clement leaned forward, her tone nearly comforting. Or does time twist differently here? Last year, last month, yesterday, how can you tell? A cold shiver passed around the table. Memories broken, waterlogged, long suppressed, began dragging themselves back to the surface. Violet's breath caught as a vision hit her. This same hall, this same table, but younger faces, brighter clothes, laughter echoing off the walls. And then something shattering that joy. The accident, she murmured. Miss Clement shook her head slowly. No accident, not then, not ever. Another course appeared with a soft hiss of displaced air, roasted game birds stuffed with chestnuts and herbs. The aroma should have been comforting, but tonight it wafted like a funeral offering. As they ate, though none wanted to, the memories sharpened. A girl, barely grown, apron dusted with flour, eyes far too brave for her age. Mary, Violet whispered. Her name was Mary. Mr. Blackstone's rigid posture collapsed. She threatened to report what she saw, everything. Our names, our families, all we had built. Dr. Carmichael swallowed hard. We convinced ourselves there was no other option, that protecting ourselves was justified. We chose, Violet said, her voice cracking under the weight of the truth returning. We chose to destroy her instead of facing what we'd done. Mr. Fitzwilliam shook his head violently, but the denial tasted hollow even to him. The scandal would have ruined us. Everything would have fallen apart. So you made sure she fell instead, Miss Clement said, her voice now heavy with sorrow. A girl whose only mistake was speaking truth. The fog lifted fully. The plan whispered in the library. The tea laced with silent death. The way Mary's hands trembled as she drank it, unaware of the betrayal surrounding her. And every one of them had agreed to it. They had dragged Mary's lifeless body through the quiet dark, telling themselves they were doing what had to be done. They'd lowered her into the forgotten well behind the stables, listening as the splash swallowed the evidence of their sin. 1 girl gone, 9 reputations saved, or so they convinced themselves. But the lie hadn't saved any of them. One by one, through the years that followed, each member of their little circle had met an end that felt natural only on the surface. Dr. Carmichael collapsing in his office, Mrs. Ashworth drifting quietly away in her sleep, Mr. Blackstone thrown from his horse on a calm, clear morning. Strange accidents, Convenient timing, because every one of them had already been dead for years. Miss Fairchild's voice trembled like a candle about to go out. Then, how long have we been here? How long have we been gone from the world? Miss Clement's answer was steady. Time has no anchor in this place. We come when we are summoned. We repeat what we did. We relive what we chose. Mary Whitmore makes certain we never slip into forgetfulness. More memories force their way to the surface, sharper now, crueler in their clarity. The night that had started with cards and wine, a pleasant gathering between wealthy friends. The discovery that young Petton had been siphoning money from the railway pension fund. The panic, the whispered fears, the realization that their investments, their fortunes, would crumble if the truth came out. They had not just silenced Mary. They had covered up Petton's crime and taken the stolen money for themselves. 9 people safeguarding their futures by burying a young maid who had dared to see too much. And then, as though her name were the key, the air at the head of the table began to shimmer. A figure stepped out of the fatting light, barely 19, dark hair, eyes filled with quiet sorrow, and something colder beneath it. Mary Whitmore. Their secret, their guilt, their punishment. You remember now, she said, her voice young but impossibly old. You remember what you stole from me, my life, my years, everything I might have been. Mr. Fitzwilliam suddenly jerked, his body racked with violent spasms. Foam did not spill from his mouth this time. The attack came from inside him, from whatever force ruled this place. He clutched his chest, gasping, trembling. Please, he choked out. Please, I'm begging you. I'm sorry. We're all sorry. Mary did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Sorry is a word spoken too late, she said evenly, and it does not bring back the dead. Fitzwilliam's trembling slowed, then stopped. His frame sagged forward as the last of his life, or whatever passed for life in this place, slipped away. His outline blurred, thinned, and vanished. Another chair stood empty. 5 left. 5 left. 5 guilty souls staring into the eyes of the girl they had buried. And then, as if the room itself were mocking them, the final course appeared. A towering trifle layered with custard, sponge, and fruit, glistening under the dim candlelight like a dessert prepared for celebration. But no one at the table mistook it for anything other than a feast for the damned. Mary's voice rolled through the dining hall with the quiet certainty of someone who had waited decades for this moment. Every year, she said, on the night you ended my life, you are brought back here. You sit at this table, you eat this meal, and you endure the deaths you met long after justice should have claimed you. Miss Fairchild broke first. Her sobs were raw, tearing out of her like something poisonous. We were young, we were foolish, we didn't. You understood exactly what you were doing, Mary told her. Her tone wasn't cruel. That was the terrifying part. It was simply true. You knew my existence threatened the world you clung to, your status, your comfort, your lives, and you chose to remove the threat. Fairchild's tears grew frantic. Her whole body shook as though invisible hands were squeezing her ribs inward, crushing her beneath the weight of her own guilt. She clawed at her throat, desperate for breath that no longer belonged to her. Her final gasp trembled through the air, and then her figure dissolved like smoke. 4 remained. Dr. Carmichael, Violet, Mr. Blackstone, and Miss Clement, unblinking, unreadable, as though she had known this moment would arrive since the night Mary died. The candles flickered violently, stretching long shadows across the table as the room seemed to lean closer, hungry for the next confession. "How many times has this happened?" Violet whispered. Her voice was barely a thread. "How many cycles have we lived through?" Mary didn't blink. "As many as it takes, until you feel the weight of the life you stole, until the truth finally becomes heavier than your denial." Dr. Carmichael suddenly stiffened. A strangled grunt escaped him as he clutched his chest. His skin turned the color of chalk. "My heart, it's happening again." He collapsed onto the table, his medical bag tumbling from his coat. The same bag that had once carried the poison that used to end Mary's life. His body stilled, then vanished. 3 left. Mr. Blackstone surged to his feet, the old military instinct rising in him, escape, confront something. But his legs buckled before he could take 2 steps. His body jerked violently, as if struck by an unseen force. The same blow he'd felt the morning his horse had thrown him. The same blow that had snapped his neck. His convulsions ended abruptly, and with a faint sigh, he dissolved like the rest. 2 remained. Violet and Miss Clement. Mary stood at the head of the table, her ghostly form glowing faintly, casting cold light across their faces. "Why?" Violet breathed. She didn't know who she was speaking to anymore, Mary, Miss Clement, or the silent darkness pressing in on them. "Why are we here at all? If we died years ago, why do we continue at all?" The room waited. Mary did not answer immediately, and the silence felt like judgment. The hall had fallen so quiet it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Miss Clement stood at the far end of the table, her outline flickering like smoke caught in a draft. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the softness of someone who had already accepted what waited on the other side. "We don't leave," she murmured, "because some wrong stained deeper than death." There was no terror in her eyes, only a frightening calm. And Violet saw, with a chill that cut straight through her, that Miss Clement wasn't fighting the pull that had dragged the others away. She was embracing it, almost grateful for it. "You knew," Violet breathed. Miss Clement's faint smile never wavered. "Every hour I lived, every moment after I didn't." And then her form thinned, unraveling into the dim air, not torn away, not screaming, simply drifting apart like a spirit finally permitted to exhale. When she vanished completely, Violet found herself alone at the ruined table, facing Mary Whitmore across the spread of guttered candles and melted wax. Their flames quivered, shadows stretching across the floor like reaching hands. Mary lifted her head. "Now it's only you." I don't understand," Violet whispered, though the lie tasted bitter. She had always known this moment would come. Mary's voice carried no anger, only certainty. "You were the one who wanted the poison. You were the one who fetched it, and you poured it into my cup while I waited to tell the truth." The words hit Violet like a blow. Memories surged forward, her youth, her beauty, the sparkling night when she celebrated her engagement inside the manor, the powerful guests, the secret they all shared, the terrible thing they'd done. And Mary, the servant girl who saw too much, who begged to speak, who had no idea how dangerous it was to know the truth. "You could have let the truth out," Mary said quietly, her gaze unwavering. "You could have let me live." "It would have destroyed us," Violet choked. "So instead," Mary answered, "you destroyed me." A familiar burn clawed up Violet's throat, the same searing agony that had ended her life years later. Her slow death had forced her to remember every choice, every lie, every scream she silenced. Now that same unseen poison coiled through her again, cold and merciless. "I'm sorry," Violet rasped, her voice breaking as the invisible grip tightened. "I'm so sorry." "I know you are, Violet." Mary's voice was soft now, almost gentle, carrying the weight of centuries of sorrow. "But remorse alone cannot undo what has been done. It cannot restore the moment stolen, the life cut short, the future stolen from me." Violet's vision blurred. The burn in her throat returned, tight and merciless, clawing at her windpipe as though she were reliving her death all over again. Her hands clawed at the table that had borne witness to so many sins. "Will it ever end?" she croaked, voice trembling, each word a struggle. Mary's form shimmered in the dim candlelight, flickering like a memory just out of reach. Silence stretched between them, thick and oppressive. Finally, she spoke, calm, unyielding. "When you understand, truly understand, the weight of a life stolen, the destruction of hopes and dreams, the infinite cost of what you took from me, then perhaps there will be rest." Violet's strength waned. Her body sagged, her breath shallow, each gasp a battle she could no longer win. Her last sight was Mary's face, young, sorrowful, and impossibly patient, staring at her with eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. Darkness swallowed her whole, merciless and absolute. Somewhere the grandfather clock chimed 12, midnight. Another October 31st marked. Another anniversary of crimes long buried but never absolved. The candles flickered and died, leaving Raven's hollow manor in a silence older than memory itself. When, if ever, morning came, the dining hall would be empty, the table polished, chairs aligned, waiting for the next summoning, the next October 31st, the next gathering of those bound by their guilt. For some sins are too deep for death to touch, and some victims demand patience beyond mortal understanding. Between life and judgment, crime and justice, the guilty would return again and again until they learned the full weight of what they had taken. Mary Whitmore would see to it. She had time. She had patience. Eternal, inexorable patience. And she would call them back as she always had, as she always would, until every lesson was etched into their souls. The manor exhaled its secrets for now, but on the moors the wind carried whispers of invitations yet to come. Somewhere between the living and the dead, 10 figures stirred, waiting. The guilty would rise again. The invitation would arrive, penned in the same elegant hand. Delivered to 10 strangers whose memories would falter but whose sins would not. And in the shadowed dining room of Raven's Hollow, Mary Whitmore would wait, unyielding, patient, and eternal, ready to serve justice, one course at a time. Raven's Hollow Manor, where the dead linger in memory and the guilty dine endlessly on the weight of their own sins, for all eternity. Story 2, The Careful Neighbor. The morning sun cut through the thin curtains, illuminating the dark, stubborn stain on Vivian Porter's kitchen floor. She hovered over it, hands raw and knuckles bleeding, as though by sheer persistence she could scrub away what had happened the night before. Time had twisted around her. Her wristwatch claimed only 20 minutes, yet her body felt as if it had been kneeling there for hours, trapped in a trance of relentless cleaning. The police had come and gone, their heavy boots echoing in her memory, voices murmuring about evidence and trajectories, the gurney scraping against the hardwood as they wheeled the body out before dawn. Reporters had stopped banging on her door by 8, their interest moving elsewhere, but the stain dark, spreading, stubborn, remained. No amount of soap, bleach, or brute force could banish it. Each attempt made it seep back, darker, alive, like the memory of a bruise that refused to fade. "You shouldn't be doing that yourself," came the soft voice from the doorway. Vivian froze. Knees cracking from hours on the floor, she turned slowly. Mr. Carty, the elderly neighbor who had once seemed kindly, stood there holding a plate of cookies, his eyes concerned. At 28, Vivian wasn't old, but she had always let Mr. Carty's attentions feel protected, even comforting. Now, after the night's horrors and with her hands raw and bleeding, the same words felt different, smaller, almost hollow, as if they carried a warning rather than care. "I'm managing, thank you," she said, taking the plate, her voice steady despite the tremor in her limbs. Her mother's lessons echoed. Never be rude to your elders. Yet even as she spoke, the feeling in the pit of her stomach told her this was no ordinary concern. Mr. Carty stepped closer, the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the sharp chemical tang of bleach. "Vivian," he said softly, "some things, some stains, they don't just come off." His gaze lingered on the floor, then on her, with a weight that made her chest tight. Vivian swallowed hard, gripping the scrub brush like a lifeline. The stain seemed to pulse beneath her fingers, as though the memory of the man who had fallen, whose blood now marked her kitchen, was still alive, still watching. She had tried to erase it, to scrub it into oblivion, but the floor had other plans. "Why won't it go away?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. Mr. Carty's eyes darkened, and for the first time Vivian saw a shadow behind the kind, careful neighbor she thought she knew. "Because," he said slowly, "some things aren't meant to be cleaned up. Not by soap, not by time. They have a way of reminding you." The kitchen felt colder now, the sunlight harsh against the linoleum that seemed to throb beneath her knees. Vivian realized the truth. This stain wasn't just on the floor. It had burrowed into her mind, her body, her very life, and no amount of scrubbing would ever make it leave. Mr. Carty handed her the plate of cookies, his hand lingering a moment too long, and said, "Be careful, Vivian. Some neighbors watch more closely than you think." And as she looked down at the dark, impossible stain, she understood. Some things once witnessed never truly vanish. Even now, every nerve in Vivian Porter's body screamed at her to slam the door, to shut out the man standing in her kitchen. Yet she couldn't move. Years of manners and habit had her rooted to the spot, forcing a politeness she no longer felt. "Thank you for this," she said softly, eyes drifting down to the coffee cake he had set on the counter. Golden, fragrant, still warm, each slice perfectly even. When had he baked it? The police had just left. She had spent the night replaying the terror, recounting it for forms, for officers, for the record. Had he been awake the entire time, quietly preparing this offering while she relived every horrifying second? He stepped further inside, reading her hesitation with unsettling ease. Courtesy was invitation, politeness was permission, and he moved accordingly. "You were through a nightmare," he said, voice calm, almost casual, scanning the room with pale eyes. He lingered over the overturned chair, the skewed lamp, the dark smear that refused to vanish from the floor, the stain she had scrubbed until her knuckles bled. And then his gaze caught hers. There was no shock there, no concern. Something darker flickered, a satisfaction that made her stomach tighten. "I'm so glad I heard you scream," he added, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Vivian nodded without thinking. Trained by decades of social expectation, it was automatic, but his words lodged in her mind like a jagged shard. Had she screamed? Her memory of the night remained fragmented, shattered into pieces that refused to align. She recalled the front door splintering, the shadow slipping across the kitchen with lethal purpose, silent and deliberate. A knife had caught the streetlight, hovering as though it had no owner, no master. Her body had frozen in place, mind frantic, begging her to move, to fight, to escape. But her limbs betrayed her. She had stood there, paralyzed, trapped in the predator's gaze. And yet screaming. She tried to summon a sound, a cry for help, any warning to neighbors, but it never came. In her mind, the night had been mute, just her own pulse, the subtle scrape of shoes on linoleum, the intruder's calm, deliberate breath. Perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps she had screamed and simply forgotten. Or perhaps the silence had always been the truth and someone, or something, had been listening the entire time, waiting. Trauma had a way of twisting the mind, hadn't it? Memories could fracture, rearrange themselves, even invent moments. Maybe she had screamed after all, her voice acting on its own, independent of conscious thought. That would explain why Mr. Carty had arrived so quickly, why he'd known she was in danger before she even realized it herself. "The officer said you were brave," she murmured instead, the words catching in her throat. It was true. Officer Hendricks had praised him for swift judgment, for responding with an almost unnatural calm in the chaos of her kitchen. Reflexes, he'd said, situational awareness honed by experience. But she hadn't asked what kind of experience a retired widower might have had with violence. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here," she added, trying to sound grateful. She noticed then the subtle shift in Mr. Carty's expression. His pale eyes seemed to gleam, the lines around them deepening with satisfaction, or something eerier, something closer to hunger for approval. He had been waiting for that recognition. "I've always kept a careful watch on this street," he said, his voice soft but insistent, filling the kitchen with a presence that felt larger than his thin frame. "Especially on you, dear. A woman alone needs someone looking out, someone noticing the things everyone else misses." The word watch slid down her spine like ice. She stiffened, uncertain why. He had been watching her. Since she moved in 3 years ago, he had known her routines, noted her comings and goings, commented on late nights at work, asked after visitors, even offered to check her locks when she left town. Concern, wasn't it? That was what it was, the polite, old-fashioned care of a neighbor in a world where people lived shoulder to shoulder yet knew nothing of each other. "I should let you rest," he said, but he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he walked to the window and stood there, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the house next door. The morning sunlight caught the silver in his thinning hair, highlighting the meticulous posture of a man who always measured himself, always observed himself, always expected to be observed. "I've been thinking," he said after a long pause, voice even, calm, carrying the authority of someone weighing facts, "about how fragile a morning can be, about what slips by unnoticed and what doesn't, about the things we see and the things we miss." Vivian felt a sudden tightness in her chest, a premonition she couldn't name, and realized with growing dread that the careful neighbor had been watching all along, but perhaps not for the reasons she had believed. After the chaos of last night, Vivian knew instinctively that ordinary precautions weren't enough. Not just deadbolts, not just a chain lock. She needed something far more deliberate, something that could truly keep danger at bay. Through the kitchen window, she watched Mr. Carty move across her yard with a precision that made her stomach tight. His eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, measuring, calculating. For the first time, she saw her home through someone else's lens, through the eyes of a man who seemed to understand the language of threat, of vulnerability. "I can set up some cameras," he said, turning back toward her, his voice calm but authoritative. "Motion sensors, a full alarm system, maybe even reinforce your locks, make your home impenetrable. I know how to handle intruders." It wasn't just concern in his tone. It was experience. years of skill packed into that quiet certainty. Vivian realized she had never asked about his past, never wondered what had shaped a man who moved like this, who thought like this, who treated security not as a hobby but as a craft. Their 3 years of neighborly conversation had always revolved around her routines, her life, her comfort, never his expertise. "That's very generous of you," she murmured automatically, the words escaping before her mind could protest. Her nerves were still raw, still shaking from fear, and the thought of someone else handling the danger felt like a lifeline she couldn't ignore. "I'll start today," Mr. Carty said, stepping toward the door with that measured, confident gait. "Can't have you feeling unsafe here." And just like that, he was gone. Vivian lingered in the kitchen, the coffee cake in her hands cooling unnoticed. The house felt altered, almost smaller, as if the night's events had shifted the walls inward. She wandered through the rooms, tracing her fingers over familiar surfaces, the sofa where she had sat reading, the lamp knocked askew in the scuffle, the back door that had opened to reveal Mr. Carty's decisive intervention. How had he known to arrive there first? The thought chilled her. She moved to inspect the door itself. No marks of forced entry, no splintered wood, no twisted metal, nothing to hint at an intruder's presence. And then her eyes drifted to the front entrance, the real point of violation where chaos had erupted. The sharp contrast between the untouched back door and the ransacked front made her question everything about the night before. Had she truly witnessed what she thought? Or had someone very close, been orchestrating more than protection? Her pulse quickened as the realization took hold. Her neighbor, her protector, knew more than he let on. And somehow, in ways she could not yet understand, he had already been several steps ahead of the danger that had nearly consumed her. The marks on the front door still told the story of last night. The splintered frame, the deep gouges where the intruder had forced his way in. But when Vivian checked the back door, the one Mr. Carty had slipped through so effortlessly, the lock was flawless, untouched. Of course it was. He had a key. She'd handed it to him months ago before a short trip to Portland, trusting him to water her plants and collect her mail. He never returned it, and she'd never thought to ask. It felt harmless back then, comforting even. But now, staring at that smooth, unbroken lock, a tremor of unease fluttered through her chest. The doorbell jolted her. A moment later, she spotted a white van in the driveway. Carty Security Solutions, printed in crisp blue lettering across the side. She hadn't known he ran a business. She hadn't known he did anything more than garden and complain about daytime TV. "I brought everything we'll need," he said cheerfully when she opened the door. And behind him stood a younger man, same pale eyes, same wiry frame, lugging a metal toolbox. "This is my nephew, Donald. He handles the technical installations." Donald barely nodded. His eyes scanned her face, then drifted downward in a slow, unsettling sweep that made her pull her robe tight around her body. She'd forgotten she hadn't changed, still wearing the loose nightclothes she'd thrown on in shock. "Maybe I should get dressed," she murmured. "No need," Mr. Carty interrupted, waving off the idea with exaggerated politeness. "We'll be outside. You won't even notice us." But she did. She noticed everything. All morning, their presence pressed against the edges of her awareness. She tried to read, but her eyes kept sliding over the same sentence. She turned on the TV, but the bright chatter of sitcoms felt impossible to follow. Each time she made herself a cup of coffee, it sat untouched until it cooled. Outside, the noise never stopped. The harsh whine of drills, the steady, rhythmic tapping of metal against wood, the murmur of voices, low, professional, just quiet enough to make her wonder what they were saying. Through the window, she saw Donald climbing ladders, moving with practiced efficiency. Strange equipment dangled from his tool belt, boxes and wires, and strange black devices she couldn't name. And there was Mr. Carty, pointing at corners, tracing angles, giving direction with the confidence of someone who had mapped her home long before today. Someone who already knew where every blind spot was, every shadow, every place she might think she was alone. This wasn't friendly help. This wasn't a neighbor doing a good deed. This was something far more deliberate. Something she was only beginning to understand. By the time the noise faded, Vivian realized this wasn't the kind of casual help people brag about in neighborhood groups. This was a coordinated operation, precise, practiced, and strangely quiet for how much equipment they were installing. She caught herself wondering, how many homes had they done this for? How many neighbors thought they were simply being protected, just like her? Around mid-morning, she noticed they'd moved into the backyard. From her bedroom window, she watched Donald attach a tiny black device high up on the siding. Its angle was perfect, aimed directly at the corner of the yard where she often sat on warm nights, reading under the porch light with a glass of wine in her hand. It was so small she would never have spotted it on her own. The little lens winked in the sunlight like a watchful eye. A prickling unease crawled across her skin. They could see her right now. That thought punched the air out of her lungs. She stepped away from the window, feeling ridiculous and exposed at the same time. Why hide? Why feel guilty for looking at workers on her own property? But that didn't stop the knot forming in her stomach. At noon sharp, the knock came. "All done," Mr. Carty said proudly. "Want to see the setup?" He led her to the spare bedroom, her quiet little reading room that now looked like a surveillance hub. A sleek monitor sat on the desk, divided neatly into 4 feeds: her porch, her driveway, her back door, her garden. "All motion trigger," he explained, tapping the screen with a practiced finger. "Everything gets recorded, and this," he pointed to a bright red switch, "connects straight to me. You press that and I'm at your door in half a minute. No waiting, no risk." Vivian swallowed. The system was impressive, more advanced than anything she'd imagined needing. "How much should I pay you?" she asked quietly. He gave a small laugh and waved it away. "Absolutely nothing. After what happened, this is the least I can do." Then he smiled. A smile she couldn't quite read. "It helps me rest easier too, knowing you're protected." That night she couldn't stop checking the monitor. Every few pages of her book, her eyes would drift to that glowing screen. Her yard looked strange and infrared, too sharp, too pale, everything washed in an eerie ghost light. Things she knew by heart, her rose bushes, her patio chairs, the curve of the walkway, looked distorted, like familiar faces seen through water. Nothing moved out there. Nothing stirred. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't the one doing the watching anymore. She was the one being watched. Her front door didn't look like her front door anymore. On the monitor, the cheerful yellow paint she'd chosen last spring looked washed out and hollow, like a smile stretched over a locked jaw. The driveway where she parked every day seemed strangely exposed under that cold, unblinking lens. And her backyard, usually her favorite refuge, now looked like a hollow stage set where shadows crouched, waiting. She kept telling herself this was safety. This was what protection meant now. Eyes that didn't close, machines that didn't sleep, vigilance she could rely on. And yet, every time she checked the screen, Something inside her twisted tighter. She didn't feel safer. She felt studied, as if every inch of her home had been turned into a glass box, as if she were the one under observation. She tried to settle into routine, brushing her teeth, letting the familiarity calm her nerves, until she glanced through the bathroom doorway and froze. There in the upper corner of her bedroom wall, something glinted. At first she convinced herself it was just a shadow, a misplaced reflection, maybe light catching on a nail or a bit of metal. But when she stepped closer, her breath collapsed in her throat. A tiny lens stared back at her. A camera, a real one, pointed straight at her bed. Her toothbrush slipped from her fingers and hit the tile with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent house like a warning shot. She gripped the sink to steady herself, feeling her knees buckling. No, this couldn't be real. But the little red dot glowing on that hidden device said otherwise. Recording. Watching. She forced herself into the bedroom, every step slow, deliberate, as though sudden movement might alert someone on the other end. The lens tracked nothing, silent, still, but she felt its presence like a cold hand on the back of her neck. This was her room, her sanctuary, the place she undressed, slept, cried, lived. And someone had placed a camera there without her knowing. She sat down on the edge of her bed as her thoughts fractured and collided. The red emergency button, the one he told her would summon him in 30 seconds. He'd been so confident, so reassuring. Now she wondered, how long had he been watching this room? How many moments had he witnessed? How many had he saved for later? The thought settled over her like ice water. She wasn't being protected. She was being observed, as if he'd been waiting. The thought hit her like ice water down her spine. He hadn't come from outside. He hadn't been strolling by. He had appeared instantly, too instantly. At the exact moment the intruder cornered her, as if he knew precisely when the danger would peak. Vivian swallowed hard, the room tilting. For 3 years she had trusted him. For 3 years she had opened her door to him, accepted his cakes, his warm smiles, his gentle questions about her daily routine. When do you work? When do you come home? Are you sleeping well these days, dear? She used to think it was just kindness. Now she wasn't sure. Her pulse throbbed painfully in her neck as she replayed it all. The cameras, the hidden angles, the perfect placement. The fact they had been installed during renovations. Renovations she had been too overwhelmed to supervise herself. The spare key. The workers coming in and out. And one man who always offered to keep an eye on the place for her. Mr. Carty. Suddenly she remembered the moment the police praised him, how he kept interrupting, how he insisted she didn't need to see the intruder's body, how he volunteered information before she even spoke, how he always arrived a little too quickly, a little too close, always appearing when she needed help, almost like he knew. Vivian's breath caught in her throat. If the intruder hadn't known Carty would be there, maybe he wasn't the one watching her at all. Maybe he was just another victim, someone who stumbled into a house already under someone else's surveillance, someone who panicked because he realized he wasn't just breaking into a home, he was breaking into a trap. Vivian felt her knees weaken as a colder truth settled over her. The cameras weren't signs of a predator studying her. They were signs of a guardian who needed to watch everything, someone who needed her whole life monitored, someone who needed control, not information. and the only person who had both the time and the access was the man who'd saved her. She turned slowly toward the window facing Mr. Carty's house. The curtains were open, and behind the glass, barely visible in the dim glow of a lamp, he was standing there, watching her, not smiling, not waving, just watching, as if he'd never stopped. He wasn't supposed to be there. That was the first thought that hit her as the memory rewound in her mind, sharpened now, stripped of the shock that had softened it the night it happened. The man who had saved her hadn't burst in from the street. He had slipped quietly through the back entrance, the one only he had access to, the one no one had tampered with. And when he entered, he didn't look surprised. Vivian's feet carried her to the kitchen as if some unseen thread were pulling her. The faint outline of dried blood still stained the floor. She crouched beside it, eyes narrowing, forcing herself to relive what her brain had tried so hard to blur. The intruder had a knife, yes, but he hadn't lunged. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't even looked at her in those last few seconds. His gaze had drifted past her shoulder, landing on something or someone behind her. And just moments before the blast, he'd spoken. Not a threat, not a curse. A plea. Please, I don't want to do this. At the time, she thought he was begging her for mercy, but now the memory played differently in her mind. His voice had trembled. His eyes had widened. His body had gone rigid, like a man cornered by something worse than being caught. What if his fear wasn't for her? What if it was for the person holding the shotgun? Her chest tightened. Her thoughts began forming connections she didn't want to make. She tried to push them away. He was a good neighbor. He was a sweet old man. He saved you. But the truth kept sliding beneath those memories like a knife under wallpaper. The cameras in her home, in every room, hadn't been installed after the break-in. They'd been there for months, some since the day she moved in, and they weren't pointed at doors like security devices. They were pointed at her. A slow dread crept through her bones. She couldn't go back to her bedroom, not with that silent black eye staring down at her from the ceiling. So she stayed awake in the living room, curled into the corner of the couch, listening to every tiny noise like the house itself had grown teeth. Her gaze drifted repeatedly to the monitor he had left her, the one meant to make her feel safe, the one she now realized might show her exactly what he wanted her to see. Hours crawled by. Then around 3 in the morning, static flickered across the screen, and a shape emerged. A figure stood at the edge of her garden, thin, still, wrapped in a robe that shifted faintly in the breeze. He wasn't walking, he wasn't knocking, he wasn't checking anything. He was simply looking up at her house, looking at her windows, watching, waiting, as if the night wasn't dark enough. The infrared view washed him in a ghostly glow, his face drained of anything human, just a pale mask floating in the dark. Vivian's thumb hovered over the red panic button and froze. If she pressed it, he would come straight to her door. He would ask what frightened her. He would speak softly, offer comfort, step across her threshold, and she would have to let him in. Because how do you tell someone you're terrified of the man who supposedly saved you? So she didn't move. She just sat there, watching him stand in her garden like some midnight sentinel studying a specimen. He didn't shift. He didn't wander. He just stared at her windows for nearly an hour before calmly turning back toward his house. As he did, a faint glow caught her eye, something small in his hand. A screen, maybe a phone, maybe a tablet, something capable of showing exactly what her bedroom camera saw every night. Her stomach twisted. By sunrise, she had made her decision. She wasn't going to work. She couldn't smile at coworkers or sit through meetings while her mind was unraveling the last few years of her life. Instead, she stayed home and typed his name into every search bar she could find. There wasn't much: a widower, a move across states, years spent in the security industry, all harmless enough until she found an old article buried in a local Detroit archive. 12 years ago, a string of break-ins had terrorized single women in a quiet neighborhood. A security specialist named Harold Carty had been questioned. Routine procedure, the article said, and later cleared when the supposed culprit was found dead in his apartment. According to the report, the man had died during a struggle with one of his intended victims. And the victim, she survived only because a neighbor had rushed in to save her. Vivian stared at the article until her eyes blurred. The pattern was identical, like a story he'd performed before. A series of intrusions, rising danger, a final confrontation, a heroic rescue, and then relocation. A new town, a new life, a new woman living alone next door. The doorbell shattered the silence. Her body tensed. Through the narrow glass beside the door, she saw him standing on her porch as if nothing in the world was amiss. He held a warm plate covered in foil, the same friendly offering he'd brought her so many times before. His face wore the usual softness, the same gentle concern. But now she saw something else beneath it, something sharper, something patient, something hungry. "You look tired, dear," he said, his voice muffled through the door but unmistakably warm. And for the first time, Vivian understood exactly why she felt that way. When she cracked open the door, he greeted her with that soft, practiced smile. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone dripping with concern that didn't feel quite real. "I'm fine," she answered, though the words came out thin and brittle. Without waiting to be asked, he stepped inside, familiar, comfortable, as if her home were nothing more than an extension of his own. "You've been through a terrifying ordeal," he said. "It's normal to feel shaken. Maybe you should stay with relatives for a bit." "I don't have family nearby," she replied before she could stop herself, and immediately regretted revealing it. The truth hung in the air like bait. He gave a sympathetic nod and lowered himself into her living room chair, settling in as though he'd been invited. "Well then," he said lightly, "I guess it's up to me to watch over you. We can't risk anything happening to the neighborhood's little miracle." The word miracle made her chest tight. It felt less like praise and more like a debt he was reminding her to repay. "I should probably lie down," she murmured. "Of course," he replied, but he stayed exactly where he was. A moment later, he added casually, "I went over last night's camera recordings. You were wandering a lot. Everything okay?" Her stomach twisted. So he had been watching. The bedroom, the hallway, every inch of her home. She forced a steady breath. "Just nightmares." "Perfectly reasonable," he said. "Trauma stirs up all kinds of illusions, makes people imagine danger where there is none." His voice dropped into something gentle and poisonous. "You're not starting to construct fantasies, are you?" It wasn't a question, it was a leash. A warning wrapped in kindness. A reminder that if she dared to voice what she'd seen, what she feared, no one would take her seriously. Not after what she'd survived. Not when the man she feared was the same man everyone called a hero. "No," she said, choosing each word like stepping stones over fire. "Just tired." "Good," he replied, with a smile warm enough to wilt her blood. I'd hate to see you make a mistake that puts you in danger." When the door finally closed behind him, she sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the quiet walls closing in around her. Who could she call? Who would believe her? To the outside world, she would sound unhinged, a traumatized woman unraveling after a home invasion. The police would dismiss her. Her friends would comfort her politely but doubtfully. Her coworkers barely knew her name. She had always been alone. But now, solitude felt less like a habit, and more like a trap she'd been guided into. Vivian's chest tightened as realization hit her like a hammer. She wasn't just a survivor of a random attack. She had been trapped. For 3 years, Mr. Carty had patiently woven himself into her life, earning her trust, presenting himself as a guardian, until the moment came when she would need him. And then, like clockwork, danger had arrived. The intruder hadn't stumbled upon her house by chance. Someone had orchestrated it, guided him like a pawn toward her doorstep, exploiting his anger and fear. Someone who understood exactly how to push the right buttons, to create a scenario where he could step in as the hero, the savior, and she would be completely reliant on him. Vivian's mind replayed the man's final words. "Please, I don't want to do this." Not the confident declaration of a predator, but the quiet desperation of a man coerced, a man forced into a role he had never chosen. He was as much a victim as she had been. She needed proof, hard evidence that would show the world the truth about Mr. Carty. Not just whispers or suspicions, but the kind of facts that could survive scrutiny. She had to uncover what had really driven the intruder to her house that night. But first, she had to slip free of Carty's constant gaze. That evening, she staged her usual bedtime routine, leaving lights on here and there, moving about in predictable patterns to give the illusion of normalcy. Once the house settled into darkness, she slipped out through the narrow basement window, careful to stay out of any camera angles. The shadows swallowed her as she crept across the side yard, heart pounding with adrenaline and fear. She already knew his name, Michael Flores, 26, living in a small, dingy studio on the east side of town. The police had combed his apartment, uncovering the usual: stolen items, notes, the detritus of a disturbed mind. But they had been hunting for evidence of guilt, not manipulation, not the invisible strings that had guided his hand that night. When she reached the apartment building, something felt off. The door wasn't sealed with police tape as she had expected. Instead, it hung slightly ajar, like someone had left in a hurry, careless. Her pulse quickened. Pushing it open, she stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, fear, and neglect, a small studio that smelled of desperation. The place looked untouched since the police had cleared it, yet something about it whispered that it had not been abandoned entirely. Every step she took into that cramped space felt like peeling back another layer of a terrifying secret. She knew she was entering dangerous territory, but there was no turning back. Someone had controlled the narrative of her life, shaped her reality, and now Vivian was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what shadows she had to chase, no matter what risks lay waiting in the darkness. The apartment was almost empty, but not in a peaceful way. It felt abandoned midlife, as if someone had stood up one morning and walked out forever. Overdue notices curled on the floor, newspapers lay yellowed with time, and the furniture looked like it had given up long before its owner did. Vivian moved through the room with the patience of someone who knew the truth was hiding here. She checked drawers, corners, shelves, nothing, until she slid her hand under the bed and touched a cardboard box coated in dust. Inside, she didn't find what she expected. These weren't crime victims. These were photos of Michael. Michael buying bread, Michael waiting for his laundry, Michael stepping into his building every night like clockwork. Someone had tracked his every move, angles, timestamps, distance, routine. Whoever followed him studied him the way hunters study prey. And beneath those photos, more faces. Young men, all carrying the same hollow expression she'd seen in the paper beside Michael's article, eyes full of secrets and fear. Some pictures crisp, others worn and decades old, but all connected by the same silent suffering. At the bottom of the box lay a stack of clippings. Different cities, different years, same story. A violent attack. A terrified woman. A mysterious Good Samaritan who just happened to be nearby. The attacker always ended up dead. The hero always moved on. Detroit, Phoenix, Sacramento, Portland. City after city, a trail of carefully staged tragedies with one man always emerging as the savior. Vivian's pulse hammered in her throat. This wasn't luck. This was a pattern, a performance. A man manufacturing danger so he could swoop in as the rescuer. And every time he wanted a fresh story, he needed a new puppet to blame men like Michael. Her hands trembled as she photographed every page, every scrap, every name. She closed the box, stood up to leave, then spotted something wedged between the mattress and the wall. A small leather journal, edges cracked from use. Michael's handwriting covered the first pages, shaky, frantic entries from months earlier. He knew he was being followed. He felt eyes on him everywhere he went. He didn't dare go to the police. Who would believe a man with his record? As she flipped through the journal, the entries darkened. Strange packages left outside his door. Knives, photos of strangers, notes listing what time they left for work, where they parked, who lived alone. Late night calls from a voice that never rose above a whisper. Instructions disguised as threats. Warnings disguised as favors. And in one of the final entries, Michael confessed the fear he never shared with anyone. He knows everything about me. Things I never said out loud. Vivian closed the journal with a slow, steady breath. Whatever happened to Michael Flores, he never stood a chance. He had written it like a man cornered from every direction, terrified, shaky, convinced his entire future was dangling by a thread. Whoever controlled him knew the worst parts of his past, the kind of secrets that could bury someone for good. And he made the threat simple: obey and live. Refuse, and your life ends behind bars. The final page looked different from the rest, scarred with deep scratches where the pen had dug into the paper. It was dated the same night he'd shattered into Vivian's home. "I don't want to do this," he wrote. "She's done nothing to deserve it. She keeps to herself. She's kind." But he promised this is the last task. After tonight, freedom. I don't believe him. He never lets go. He's outside now, watching. The old man won't stop. Vivian closed the journal with numb fingers and tucked it securely inside her jacket. She had everything: proof of manipulation, proof of stalking, proof that Michael had been pushed into a nightmare with no exit. This was enough to expose the truth behind Cardi's mask. But the moment she stepped into the cool night, her breath caught in her throat. He was waiting. Cardi stood next to her car as if he'd been molded from the shadows themselves, hands clasped neatly at his back, his familiar, soft smile spread across his face. A smile she once thought harmless, a smile that now felt like a blade wrapped in velvet. Beside him leaned Donald, the nephew, silent, rigid, his pale eyes hollow in the streetlight. When she'd first met him, she mistook his coldness for shyness. Now it read like quiet obedience and quiet threat. Well, hello, dear, Cardi said in his usual warm, neighborly tone, enjoying a little nighttime stroll. Vivian's pulse thudded so hard she could feel it in her teeth, yet she forced her body to stay still, her breath steady. She managed a faint smile that tasted like fear. Couldn't sleep, she replied. Thought a walk might clear my head. Lovely idea, Cardi murmured, nodding as if she'd shared a recipe instead of an excuse. Donald shifted subtly, stepping just close enough to block her path. The message was unmistakable. This part of town isn't exactly safe for someone alone, Cardi continued, his voice honey-sweet. Why don't we give you a ride home? It wasn't kindness. It wasn't an offer. It was an instruction. Donald opened the passenger door with the mechanical calm of someone who'd done this many times before. Cardi extended his hand toward her, waiting for the keys with the gentle patience of a schoolteacher, expecting a misbehaving student to hand over the chalk. She surrendered them. The ride was suffocatingly quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Then, without looking away from the road, Cardi finally spoke. I trust your little outing was productive. Vivian stared straight ahead. I'm not sure what you're implying. Aren't you? His tone stayed friendly, but underneath it was something new, a cold certainty, a predator's calm. I saw you tonight, he murmured, on the basement cameras, quite clever slipping out that window, just not clever enough. Vivian's fingers dug into the steering wheel, knuckles whitening as she tried to keep her breath steady. The cameras don't reach the basement, she managed. No, Cardi agreed softly, almost amused. But they see the street. I watched you pull away. It wasn't difficult to guess your destination. Curiosity is a powerful thing. People crave answers and someone to blame. They rolled down Belmont Avenue, past the quiet houses lined up like innocent bystanders. Warm lamps glowed behind curtained windows. Families slept peacefully inside, completely unaware that a predator lived steps away, guiding tragedies like a conductor guiding a symphony. The journal, Cardi said suddenly, almost cheerfully. I imagine you came across it. Michael always loved to write. Very dramatic, very frightening, very useful. Vivian stayed silent. Anyone who reads it, he continued, will see exactly what I intended. A troubled young man unraveling, hallucinations, paranoia, imagining monsters in every shadow. It will help the police neatly wrap up his behavior. Mental instability is such a tidy explanation for chaos. The car slowed to a stop in her driveway. Cardi didn't move to exit. The air between them felt suffocating. You wrote it, Vivian whispered. You fabricated the whole thing, planted it for them to find. Cardi sighed as if discussing a minor household chore. Only parts of it. Michael's real entries were clumsy, unfocused. I refined them, sharpened them, added touches that made the story believable. The photos, too, powerful pieces of evidence when arranged in the right order. Her voice cracked. Why would you do this? Why hurt so many people? Cardi turned toward her with deliberate calm. Under the dim streetlight, his face looked hollowed out, older than she'd ever seen, and infinitely darker. Because I can, he said, almost tenderly. Because I'm exceptional at it. And because being needed is intoxicating. There is nothing as thrilling as stepping in at the perfect moment and being hailed as a savior. He lifted a hand and brushed her cheek with the back of his fingers. The touch was soft, but it made bile rise in her throat. You were ideal, he murmured. Living alone, quiet, careful. A woman who seemed so strong, but just lonely enough to depend on someone. I learned everything about you, your habits, your fears, the way you double-check locks when you're nervous. I spent years building trust with you." His eyes gleamed with pride. And Michael, well, he was a blessing I didn't expect. A frightened young man with a messy past, easy to shape, easy to direct. I spent months molding him, preparing him to play the part I needed. Cardi's smile returned, that same gentle, neighborly smile that once felt safe. Now it felt like a trap with teeth. Vivian's pulse hammered so loud it felt like it filled the car. Cardi's voice, calm and almost grandfatherly, slid through the darkness like a blade. "I shaped him," he said, "piece by piece. Fear, guilt, desperation, all the ingredients you need to build the perfect villain. And when the moment was ripe, I sent him to your doorstep. I simply let the story play out." "He didn't want to hurt me," Vivian whispered, as if saying it aloud might make it truer. "No," Cardi replied. "He didn't, but he feared me far more than he pitied you. Fear makes people obedient. It makes them imaginative. It makes them capable of horrors they never believed they could commit." Vivian's fingers inched toward the door handle, a desperate, trembling hope, but Cardi's hand snapped around her wrist with shocking force. His grip was iron, his voice soft. "I wouldn't do that. You have nowhere to go, no one willing to hear what you'd say. And if you try to betray me, there are so many ways I can make your life collapse." He leaned closer, his breath warm, his words colder than winter. "The authorities will find whatever narrative I choose for them. A frightened woman unraveling. Someone traumatized, spiraling into delusions, unable to cope. A tragic ending to a sad story." He loosened his grip, only to pat her hair with the tenderness of a parent soothing a child. "But none of that is necessary," he murmured. "You can let me protect you. Accept the care I've invested in you. I've given you years of attention, dear. You could show a little gratitude." "And if I do," her voice was barely air. Cardi's eyes brightened with something cruel. "Then I'll be disappointed, and disappointment makes me reckless. I may decide another unfortunate young man should enter your life, someone more volatile than Michael, and next time I may arrive too late to save you." He opened his door, stepping out as if they'd simply finished a friendly chat. Then he bent down, meeting her eyes through the window. "Think about your choices. You can live in constant dread, always waiting for the next shadow to move. Or you can live under the protection of someone who truly understands what you need." "That's not protection," she whispered. "That's captivity." Cardi tilted his head, almost pitying. "Is the difference really that important?" he asked softly. "Good night, dear, sleep well, and remember I'm always watching." He strolled back toward his house, pausing at the doorway to give her a polite, neighborly wave before disappearing behind his curtains. Vivian stayed frozen in her seat long after he was gone, staring at the immaculate home across the street, the rose beds, the trimmed lawn, the curtains hiding a man who built monsters like other people garden. Eventually, she forced herself to step out, to walk toward her own front door, knowing the cameras perched in every corner were already following her every move. Vivian stared at the small red button glowing like an ember on her coffee table, the same button that once promised safety, but now felt like a loaded gun pointed at her life. Every corner of her house watched her, every silent camera ready to alert the man who had crafted her terror piece by piece. She sat alone in the dim room, and the truth settled over her like a cold, heavy blanket. There were no good options, only different kinds of ruin. She could run, but he'd hunt her like he'd hunted the others. She could fight, but he owned the story, the evidence, the narrative. She could give in, but that meant letting him hollow her out until nothing of her remained. Or she could burn everything he built, even if it meant burning herself with it. Outside, the neighborhood slept behind warm windows and porch lights, a peaceful suburb that never realized a predator lived right beside them, polishing his masks, choosing his next damsel to save. Vivian took a breath that scraped her lungs and lifted her phone. Her fingers shook, but she typed. She uploaded the photographs, the surveillance shots, the staged gifts, the records of the men he'd broken. She posted Michael's writings, the clippings, the pattern that followed Harold Carty from city to city like a shadow he carried on purpose. She told the world exactly how he crafted his hero stories, how he built monsters and then swooped in to slay them. She wrote even as she imagined Carty watching her through the lenses hidden in her walls. She wrote knowing that he'd already be preparing a counter-narrative, a fragile woman unraveling, seeing monsters where none existed. She wrote knowing he'd twist her truth into delusion, knowing people might not listen, knowing he might slip away and start again under a new name. But she kept going because this moment, was the first thing she'd chosen for herself. When the final post went live, she set her phone on the table. Her hands were steady now. She looked at the red button. The halo of light around it pulsed faintly, as if waiting for her to cave and call her protector. She imagined Carty next door, packing, replaying her posts, calculating which punishment fit her disobedience. He would be furious. Worse, he would be disappointed. And a disappointed Harold Carty was dangerous. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Vivian felt something cut through the fear, a quiet, stubborn strength. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't begging. She wasn't his victim. Whatever stepped through her door next, whether it was Harold, the police, or something even darker, she would face it as herself. A woman who refused to be owned. Outside, the street remained serene, porch lights glowing soft and harmless. But beneath that calm surface, something had shifted. One of its monsters had been dragged into the light, and the night was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do now. Vivian's posts had sent shockwaves through the quiet neighborhood. The careful web of lies, the meticulously staged heroics, the invisible strings he'd pulled for years, all of it was fraying at the edges. Every uploaded photo, every journal entry, every newspaper clipping illuminated the truth that Harold Carty had spent a lifetime hiding. Across the thin fence in the house that once seemed so harmless, Carty stared at his monitors, his calm mask cracking. The predator who had orchestrated fear and heroism alike now felt the first twinge of real danger. Plans he'd executed flawlessly for years were exposed, his control slipping like sand through his fingers. He began to calculate, to strategize, his mind racing. The game he thought he dominated had suddenly shifted, the stakes higher than ever. This was no longer a quiet neighborhood, no longer a simple tale of rescue. Vivian had pulled back the curtain, and now Harold Carty faced an opponent who refused to be controlled. Outside, the world remained oblivious, the streetlights flickering over neat lawns and silent windows. But inside both houses, the tension was electric. One woman had dared to strike back, and one man was about to realize that even the most careful plans could unravel faster than he ever imagined. Story 3, The Quiet Harvest. Detective Ray Burdett stood in the crisp autumn air, leaves swirling around his feet in the cracked asphalt lot of Harmony Elementary. Bakersfield's wind carried a faint chill, scattering yellow remnants of summer across the aged playground. The school itself looked like a relic. Low, brick buildings joined by sagging covered walkways. Swings and slides faded and chipped from decades of little hands, and walls painted that lifeless institutional beige that seemed to swallow the laughter of children whole. Beside him, Principal Janet Moore trembled, her fingers knotted so tightly that her knuckles glowed white in the afternoon sun. She looked a decade older than her 50 years, and Burdett didn't blame her. 3 children had disappeared in a single month, stolen from the safe confines of their classrooms, not from recess, not walking home, but from their very beds during nap time. One moment they lay on their mats, breathing softly, dreaming of toy blocks and crayons. The next, they were gone. The cameras, they show nothing, Moore whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of fear. They're just gone, no doors open, no footsteps, no signs at all. Burdett, 15 years on the force, had learned to trust impossibilities. They were never what they seemed. Children don't vanish. Someone was orchestrating this, someone precise, someone who understood the exact choreography needed to make abduction appear like magic. Destiny Rodriguez, 6, snatched 3 weeks ago from Mrs. Patterson's first grade class. Kevin Nakamura, 7, taken 2 weeks ago from Mrs. Chen's second grade classroom. Amber Kowalski, barely 5, vanished 4 days ago from the kindergarten mats. I want the footage, Burdett said, voice sharp but calm. Moore led him down the narrow hallways, their shoes tapping against linoleum, passing walls plastered with pumpkin cutouts, turkey handprints, and scribbled crayon masterpieces. The scent of disinfectant clung to the air, mingled with milk, crayons, and that undefinable perfume of childhood, sweet, fleeting, and fragile. In her office, Moore pulled up the security feed. Burdett's eyes scanned the grainy footage with practiced intensity. 23, 24, 25 frames, and there it was. The children asleep on their mats, and then nothing. No door opening, no intruder, just empty spaces where tiny bodies had been moments before. Burdett felt a cold prickle run down his spine. Whoever had taken them didn't need doors or windows. Whoever had done this had a mastery over space, time, and perception, an unseen predator moving through walls and shadow. He leaned closer to the screen, the edges of the room fatting around him. The quietness of the school suddenly screamed with secrets. 3 children, stolen from the safety of their classrooms, and somewhere in the hallways, the invisible hand of the kidnapper still lingered, waiting. Burdett knew one thing: this wasn't random. This was a pattern, and to stop it, he had to see what no one else could, what hid in plain sight in the spaces where innocence was meant to be safe. Outside, the wind continued to scatter leaves, as if mocking the fragility of the lives that had just vanished into thin air. And Detective Burdett made a silent promise. Someone would pay for this, and he would find them. The quiet harvest had begun, and he was ready to chase it to the very end. The footage flickered on the screen, showing children settling onto their nap mats, tiny bodies curling into blankets, soft breaths rising and falling in rhythm. The timestamp read 1:50. Mrs. Patterson dimmed the lights, settling into her desk to grade papers. Then it happened. At 1:47 p.m., Destiny Rodriguez lay peacefully near the back corner. 1 minute she was there, the next, 1:48 p.m. The mat was empty, no door open, no footsteps, just empty space. Play it again, Detective Burdett ordered, his voice low and tense. He rewound frame by frame, over and over. Nothing. No glitch, no skipped frames. Just a child erased from the world in an instant. The other children slept on, completely unaware, and Mrs. Patterson never looked up from her work. The other disappearances followed the same chilling rhythm. Kevin Nakamura gone at 1:52 p.m. from Mrs. Chen's second grade classroom. Amber Kowalski vanished at 1:44 p.m. in kindergarten. Always during nap time. Always precise. Always impossible. Burdett leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Who has access to the cameras?" he asked. "Me, the vice principal, and our head custodian," Principal Moore replied, voice tight. "And the system hasn't been tampered with. The police confirmed it." "Tell me about your staff. Anyone new? Anyone acting unusual?" She shook her head. "Most of our staff have been here for years. The only relatively new one is our head custodian, Ezra Gideon, but he's been here 3 years now." Burdett's pulse quickened. He felt that familiar investigative spark, the one that told him he was close. "I want to speak with him." "That might be challenging," Moore said. "Ezra is deaf. He communicates mostly through notes, some basic sign language he keeps to himself." Burdett didn't flinch. He needed answers. Where was Gideon now? Usually he worked the late shift but came in around noon to prep the building for afternoon cleaning. They found him in the basement, hunched over the furnace, hands dirty with soot. He was tall, thin, prematurely gray, and his brown eyes held a quiet intensity behind wire-rimmed glasses. He straightened immediately when he saw them, wiping his hands on a rag. Principal Moore tapped him on the shoulder, gesturing toward Burdett. Gideon's gaze fixed on the detective with unnerving focus. Moore handed a notepad to Burdett. He scribbled, "This is Detective Burdett. He has some questions about the missing children." Gideon read it, nodded, and carefully wrote back, "I am sorry about the children. It is a terrible thing." Burdett handed him the pad. "Did you notice anything unusual on the days they disappeared? Anyone in the building who shouldn't have been here?" Gideon read the question slowly, then shook his head. He wrote with careful precision, "I see nothing. I work alone, mostly in the basement and hallways. I don't interact with classrooms much." But Burdett didn't believe it, not entirely. Something about Gideon's measured calm, the way he observed rather than explained, set off alarms in the detective's mind. There was more here, something hidden behind the quiet routine. And Burdett was determined to uncover it before the quiet harvest claimed another child. Detective Burdett's eyes followed Ezra Gideon as the custodian moved with quiet precision through the dim corridors of Harmony Elementary. "Tell me about the areas no cameras cover," Burdett scribbled, sliding a notepad toward the man. Gideon paused, pen hovering thoughtfully. When he finally wrote, his words formed a map of shadows. The basement, storage rooms, maintenance shafts, and narrow passages snaking between walls for pipes and wires. Burdett's mind raced. Could someone slip through these passages unseen? Gideon's response came slowly, deliberate. Possible but difficult. Passages are tight, grimy. Would need intimate knowledge of building. He hesitated again before adding, maybe longtime staff, maintenance crew, or teachers familiar with the hallways. The detective studied Gideon's face, searching for any flicker of guilt, fear, or concealment. Instead, there was only a taut vigilance, a measured wariness. "Show me," Burdett wrote. Gideon nodded, leading them to a maintenance closet. With a practiced hand, he opened a wall panel to reveal a crawl space, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Burdett peered in. The dark shaft extended like a hidden artery, branching into a network that ran behind classrooms and offices. "Where do these lead?" he asked. "All through the building," Gideon wrote. Originally for pipes and wiring, I redesigned ventilation 2 years ago, added ducts, improved airflow. That familiar investigative tingle crawled up Birded's spine. Schematics. He needed blueprints, every hidden corridor, every access point, and then a mental overlay comparing these secret paths with the precise locations and times the children vanished. As they retraced their steps upstairs, Birded noticed Gideon's fluid familiarity with every corner, every doorway, every twist of the school. For a man claiming to mostly work in the basement, he moved like someone who owned the building. Back in the principal's office, Birded scribbled one final question. Do you have any theories about what happened to the children? Gideon read the note, and for a long moment the office was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. When he finally wrote, the lines of his handwriting trembled slightly. World is very loud. Sometimes people get overwhelmed by noise. Maybe someone wanted to help children find quiet place. The words sent a chill down Birded's spine. It wasn't a confession, but it wasn't innocent speculation either. There was a darkness hidden in that careful phrasing, a suggestion that someone had the knowledge and control to orchestrate the impossible. After Gideon returned to his work, Birded turned to Principal Moore, his tone sharp and urgent. I need the building schematics, every floor, every hidden passage, and I need them now. I want a full staff list, security logs, and any maintenance records for the past 5 years. There's a pattern here, and I intend to trace it before another child disappears. Outside, the autumn wind rattled dead leaves across the asphalt. But inside, a quiet storm was gathering, and Detective Birded could feel the first threads of the truth beginning to unravel. Detective Birded's eyes burned through the scattered blueprints on his dining room table, each line of the Harmony Elementary schematics opening new possibilities and new nightmares. His apartment was silent, far too silent without the chaotic chatter of his twin daughters. He had complained about their noise when they lived with him full time. Now, without it, the quiet gnawed at him. The school's labyrinth of ducts and hidden crawl spaces, some original to the 1970s and others added over decades, sprawled across his table like a spider's web. According to the maintenance logs, Ezra Gideon had redesigned the ventilation system, every classroom connected, every hall reachable without a single step in the open. Birded pulled up the results of Gideon's background check. Born deaf due to childhood meningitis, raised in a string of foster homes, constantly an outsider. Employment records showed a pattern. Schools, institutions, jobs lasting 2 or 3 years before moving on, always leaving behind a trail quietly, without notice. He dialed Detective Martinez, the officer who had compiled the history. Detective, you found anything unusual at his past jobs? Birded asked. Funny you should ask, Martinez replied. Sacramento, a private school he worked at, students started disappearing during class naps. Not officially reported missing, but kids ended up in storage closets, unused classrooms. Administrators blamed sleepwalking. After Gideon left, it stopped. Parents had complained kids came home unusually drowsy. Pieces clicked. The pattern, subtle but unmistakable, began to take shape. What about medical history? Birded pressed. Interesting there too. 2 years in a psychiatric facility as a teen, diagnosed with selective mutism and auditory processing disorder, obsessed with excessive noise, believed the world would be better if it were quieter. Birded exhaled slowly, connecting dots that made his stomach twist. And his skills, he asked. Computer science program for 2 years. part-time work in a pharmaceutical lab before his first custodial job. Very competent with technology and precise, Martinez said. The detective leaned back, his eyes tracing the lines of the blueprints again. A man who understood every pipe, every wire, every hidden corner. A man who could move unseen, manipulate a school from the shadows, and control chaos like a puppeteer. The chill settled deeper in Burdett's bones. This wasn't just a missing child case anymore. This was a quiet predator who had been perfecting his craft for decades, waiting for the right stage and the right victims. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the blinds, scattering yellow leaves across the empty street. Inside, Detective Burdett stared at the schematics, knowing he was finally close to unraveling a nightmare that had been decades in the making. Detective Burdett's eyes scanned the schematics again, tracing every hidden crawl space and duct line. If Ezra Gideon was behind the children's disappearances, he wasn't just taking them, he was moving them unseen. The ventilation network gave him that power. The question that froze Burdett in place was simple: where? He studied the basement closely. A large storage area, isolated from the main basement, accessible only through a narrow maintenance tunnel beneath the cafeteria. Officially condemned, listed as unsafe. But for someone who knew every inch of the building, it was a perfect hiding spot. Calling for backup, Burdett returned to Harmony Elementary under the cloak of night. Gideon's car was the only light in the empty lot. They entered quietly, the principal's key in hand, and the hallways felt different, elongated, shadowed, almost alive in the dim glow of their flashlights. Every corner seemed to watch them, every creak in the floor echoing like a warning. Behind the cafeteria, hidden by stacked boxes of cleaning supplies, they found the entrance to the maintenance tunnel. Narrow, crawling only, suffocatingly dark. Burdett led the way, flashlight piercing the black, each step measured, each breath held. At the end of the tunnel was a heavy door marked authorized personnel only, unlocked. The room beyond was a grotesque blend of workshop and sinister nursery. Walls lined with soundproofing foam, tables cluttered with electronic devices, chemicals, and ventilation masks. But it was the far corner that stole the breath from Burdett's lungs. 3 small beds, each holding a sleeping child. Destiny Rodriguez, Kevin Nakamura, Amber Kowalski, motionless under pristine white sheets, their faces pale and fragile, hooked to machines that hinted at chemical sedation. Jesus Christ, one officer whispered, voice trembling. Movement behind them. Gideon, no longer the timid, polite custodian they had met in daylight. His eyes glinted with sharp intelligence, his posture calm, almost proud, holding a small device in his hand. Burdett raised his weapon. Gideon pressed a button. A shrill, piercing whine filled the room, ripping through their ears. Officers doubled over, clutching their heads in agony. The detective gritted his teeth, struggling to maintain focus as the room became a maelstrom of sound, shadows, and panic. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a confrontation with a mind that had calculated every escape, every fear, every move. And now, the final act was beginning. Burdett steadied his breathing, forcing the rising panic back down into his chest. Gideon's words slithered through the room like cold smoke, and the eerie calm in his voice was worse than the shrieking device had been. Gideon stepped closer, eyes gleaming with a fanatic clarity. Your routines, he said softly. Your blind spots, your habits, I know them better than you do. I had to. The world is deaf to suffering. Someone has to listen. Burdett kept his gun trained on Gideon, but every instinct screamed that the man was 2 steps ahead, always had been. Move away from my officer. he said, his voice low, controlled. "You're done, Ezra. Whatever you think you've built here, it ends tonight." Gideon smiled, a small, almost pitying smile. "You think this room is the extent of my work?" He gestured around at the walls, the equipment, the unconscious children. "This is a prototype, a sanctuary. You call it a prison because you don't understand peace." He took one slow step backward, not toward the door, but toward a panel on the wall. Burdett saw it too late. Gideon pressed his palm against the panel. A faint hiss echoed through the room as vents along the ceiling slid open. Burdett's stomach dropped. "Don't you do it." Gideon tilted his head with eerie serenity. "It's only a sedative mist, quiets the mind, gives clarity." The thin fog began to spill downward like ghostly threads. Burdett covered his mouth, waving the others back, shouting for them to retreat toward the tunnel. Gideon didn't move. He watched them with unsettling calm. "The children will wake peacefully," he said. "None of you, however, are ready for silence." Burdett fired a warning shot, shattering a pipe near Gideon's head. Steam burst out, clouding the corner. Gideon didn't flinch. He simply stepped sideways into the smoke, disappearing as if swallowed by the darkness itself. "Move," Burdett barked. He dragged Martinez by the vest collar, the other officers helping as the sedative fog thickened. His lungs burned, his head swam, but adrenaline kept him upright. Behind them, from somewhere deep in the smoke, Gideon's voice echoed, calm, prophetic, terrifying. "You can stop me tonight, detective, but you won't stop the silence. You won't stop what comes next." Burdett stumbled into the tunnel, gasping for cleaner air. The door slammed shut behind them with a metal clang, sealing Gideon inside, or so Burdett hoped. As they crawled toward the cafeteria, Burdett felt a chilling certainty settle over him. Gideon hadn't been bluffing. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something much larger and far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Hands of the officers, his calm, calculating composure shattered. Burdett watched as the man who had terrorized an entire school, who had turned innocence into a carefully orchestrated experiment, crumpled to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. The children stirred, blinking groggily as the sedatives began to wear off. Their small faces, pale and fragile, looked around in confusion, but they were alive. Burdett felt a wave of relief wash over him. Exhaustion, fear, and adrenaline all blending into a moment of pure clarity. He knelt beside Destiny, whispering reassuring words while Thompson checked on the other two. "You're safe now," he murmured, feeling the weight of hours of terror finally lift. The school, once a labyrinth of shadows and secrets, was now just a building again. Gideon was seated against the wall, restrained, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. Burdett realized the irony. The same implants that had given him power, the ability to hear every whisper and plan every move, had become the instrument of his undoing. Silence had finally defeated him. Outside, the first hints of dawn touched the playground, casting long shadows that crept across the asphalt. Parents would soon arrive, frantic but relieved, and the nightmare that had gripped Harmony Elementary would be over. But in that quiet morning, Burdett knew the world had been shown just how fragile innocence could be, and how precise, calculated evil could hide in the most ordinary of places. Ezra Gideon would face justice, but Burdett understood one immutable truth. Monsters like him often wait patiently, learning, watching, and preparing for the next opportunity. And it was the job of people like him to be ready. For now, though, the children were safe. and the silence that had been a weapon was finally a sanctuary. Hands trembling, Burdett watched as Ezra Gideon slumped in the handcuffs, drained and defeated. "You still don't get it," Gideon murmured, his voice thin, almost pleading. "It's not about me. It's about what I've seen the world is screaming louder every day. Someone has to shield the children from it." Burdett's gaze shifted to the three small forms lying on the beds. Their breathing was steady but shallow, clearly dulled by the weeks of sedation. As paramedics moved in, checking vitals and carefully preparing to transport them, Burdett became aware of every sound around him. The low hum of monitors, the faint static from radios, the subtle shuffle of boots on concrete. For a fleeting moment, he understood Gideon's obsession with silence. Then a tiny, fragile sound cut through the tense quiet. Destiny Rodriguez stirred on her mat, making a soft, tentative noise, half word, half cry. Burdett's chest tightened. It was raw, alive, and unmistakably human. The sound reminded him of his own daughter's sleepy murmurs, the gentle whispers of life he'd once taken for granted. 3 days later, all three children were reunited with their families. Though physically unharmed, the trauma lingered. Their memories of the ordeal were fragmented, like shards of a nightmare they could barely grasp. Psychologists warned recovery would be long and uncertain. Gideon faced the full weight of justice, charges of kidnapping, child endangerment, and assault on law enforcement. During his psychiatric evaluation, he remained unrepentant, claiming he had only sought to protect the children from the violence of sound, frustrated that the world couldn't understand his mission. Before the school reopened, Burdett returned for one final walk through the hallways. The ventilation system had been completely overhauled, cameras installed in every classroom, and the basement storage area sealed forever. He paused, listening to the emptiness that now filled the building, not the suffocating, manufactured silence Gideon had craved, but the quiet of a place on the cusp of rebirth. He remembered Destiny's tiny, life-affirming sound, and it struck him. Some noises are worth protecting. Children's laughter, friends, conversations, the clamor of everyday life. Messy, imperfect, chaotic, these were the soundtrack of being human. In his quest for peace, Gideon had nearly stolen what mattered most, the chance for life to flourish, uncontained and vibrant. As Burdett stepped outside, the sounds of the construction crew echoed through the campus. Hammers, saws, shouted instructions. A chaotic symphony that would have driven Gideon mad. To Burdett, it was music, a reminder of life returning, of a place preparing to overflow once more with the voices of children. And soon the school would reopen. The laughter, the shouts, the clatter, and the chaos would come back louder and more beautiful than ever. A defiant, living celebration of life in all its messy, noisy, glorious complexity.